So this first slide here is simply a family tree of the Christian church. It shows the beginnings and origins of the Christian church, shows the great schism, the Protestant Reformation breaking off, and we're going to focus here on the next slide on the four main branches then of the Protestant Reformation. All right, so here we have a blow up of the four main branches of the Protestant Reformation, and in this we can see the Lutheran branch, and coming out of the Lutheran branch we've got all the different evangelical free, confessional Lutherans, evangelical covenant. We got those branches coming out of Lutheran, and then you got your radical branch, and coming out of there, of course, early on there is the Moravians, and this would be where the Anabaptists and the Baptists would be coming out of here and their offshoots. And then we have the Reformed branch of the Protestant Reformation with the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians would come out of here, both your liberal and conservative Presbyterians. And then we also have the Anglican Church branch where we have the Anglicans, and we got the Methodists that come out of there, and we got the Pentecostal and charismatic Episcopal groups, and charismatic movement, all of these showing their roots back through the Anglican Church. Okay, so the first distinctive of the Lutheran Reformation is the theology of the cross. With the theology of the cross, what you have is this idea that there's this reverse relationship between, to faith. So, for instance, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. It's a bit of a paradox in how this works. So if you want to save your life, you need to lose your life. And in other words, in order to understand the world, you have to see it through the cross. Jesus, for instance, he's hung on a cross. His clothes are stripped off of him. This is a horrible indignity that he had to suffer along with the dying on the cross, and the whole thing was designed to do that. Yet it's the great victory of the Christian life, is this idea. So you have this reverse relationship. Things are not quite as you think they should be, and this is the theology of the cross. And today we have a little bit of things going the opposite direction of that, and it's literally the exact opposite of that would be a theology of glory. And inside of that, you would have the health and wealth gospel, where your deeds are very visible and upfront, and how well you do is contingent upon. And so it's the exact opposite of what the Lutherans believed with this theology of the cross. The next item on the distinctives for the Lutherans would be justification by faith alone. And this is, we're all familiar with this. It's faith without works is what justifies somebody. And we're justified because of our faith in Christ, because he is righteous, not because we are righteous, but because we receive his righteousness and that we tap into his righteousness. We are justified by faith alone. The professor teaching these lectures used the illustration of the internet. You have your computer, and the internet doesn't really reside on your computer, but you tap into it and have access to it in some way. Of course, all analogies break down at some point, but that's the same thing. We're tapping into the righteousness of Christ through the cross and by faith and without works. The next distinctive for the Lutherans would be this idea of the law and gospel hermeneutic. So according to Lutherans, the law can't be used for sanctification. The law is in many ways considered outmoded or outdated. Luther goes to the extent of even taking the book of James and the book of Revelation and putting them at the back of the Bible and not giving them page numbers or anything like that. So kind of separating them away, making it clear that he considered there to be a bit of a priority. He never said they weren't scripture, but he gave them less of priority. And why did he give those books less of priority? Well, because he couldn't see the gospel clearly in them. You looked at James and it felt like the law, for instance, and he didn't see the gospel in them, and that was just essential, is that the gospel element was present. The next distinctive of the Lutherans would be this idea of two kingdoms, and this two kingdom idea he picks up from Augustine, and this is the idea that the church and the state are not to be confused with each other. They both pursue order, but they do so differently. Each one has its own sphere of influence and control, and they were never able really the Lutherans to actualize this, but this is what they believed in these just two different kingdoms. And the final item here for the Lutherans would be this consubstantiation. Consubstantiation is not transubstantiation, but it comes an awful lot closer to transubstantiation than I was ever introduced to, I suppose. And this is the idea that Jesus is really present during the Eucharist. They believed he was there and present in the bread and the wine, not in place of the bread and wine. He was under it and behind the elements. And in many ways, I think that does, to me, harken back to the early church, where they're clearly, when they were doing communion or the Eucharist, they believed that it was the universal church taking, participating, and that Christ was actually there and present. And so perhaps in some ways they're trying to honor that, but that is the distinctives. There you have it for the Lutheran Reformation. Okay, so the elements of the Reformed Reformation, the first and I think the most important distinctive of the Reformed Reformation is this idea of distinction of creator and creature. This is really, really critical to them. God is God, man is man. We are not like God. He is distinct and different. And the two should never get mixed up. Within the Reformed idea, this idea of worshiping anything, images of any kind, is considered idolatry. So churches tend to be somewhat stark by contrast to other Christian churches. And the idea is that you'll have no other gods before me. And I say, God alone is God. And some churches, the Reformed churches, would even go as far to say that if you can't find it in the Bible, don't do it. We don't do things that we don't find in the Bible. And so that distinction between creator and creature. Number two is this sovereign grace, and this is the idea that he's kingly, that he's above all, that he's full of power. God has this royal freedom to rule as he pleases, and he dispenses his grace undeservedly as a free gift to who he pleases to dispense his gift to. It's God's riches at Christ's expense. It emphasizes this is all without merit. And this overwhelming authority is coupled with his overwhelming grace that he pours upon the creatures. And it's important that they would say that in the sovereign grace that God is in control of all. The next element for the Reformed Church is this idea of order. So the Reformed tradition really, really values order and clarity over any kind of paradox. You can see it in their language. It can get quite lengthy as they start itemizing because they want to teach the full counsel of God, and they got point 1, sub point 2, 3, and it can get very verbose, but they want it to be orderly. It's typically easy to follow, and I think some of the greatest catechisms, can come out of the Reformed movement, or do come out of the Reformed movement. Another thing that's important for them is this idea that they want to be so clear that they will itemize things. And the professor cracked a joke that I thought was pretty funny. It was just that how does a Reformed guy propose to his girlfriend in 3 points, of course, so they have this orderly structure. The next item for the Reformed Church is this correspondence between church and state. And the idea is that there is a distinction of the church and the state. They're different. They're not the same. While there is distinction, however, they do believe that they work together. And they're both under the common lordship of Christ. Christ rules over the church, but Christ also rules over the world. No one place that Jesus, that you can go is a place that Jesus doesn't cry out mine, that he owns, and it is his area. But there is this correspondence between the church and state, but they're separate, but they're both under the lordship of Christ. And finally, for the Reformed Church, is this idea of shared governance, and that is that structures are put into place to share the governing of the church, so that you don't have a single individual over everything, but there's this shared responsibility for governing the church. And it tends to put in these checks and balances so control isn't misused. And the U.S. government is set up with a polarity of leadership, and it's these clear connection, I think, with the Reformed tradition and how our branches of the government share in the power and things are distributed. And so, the Reformed element, you have this shared governance of the church. Okay, so the next branch here is the Anglican Reformation, and the first element of distinction here for the Anglican Reformation is this idea of harmony. They wanted to harmonize and reconcile, I should say, opposites, and to in doing so transcend any kind of conflict. We're talking doctrinally, they want to harmonize political harmony. They wanted to bring disparate things together and hold it all together by trying to find a harmony. Closely connected with this for the Anglicans, I think, would be the number 2 item here, which is compromise. And this is their willingness to cooperate, to give way to some kind of balance for balance sake. They were searching constantly for the middle of the road. They want to make a compromise, and this isn't necessarily, we think of compromise in our day and age as a negative thing, but this isn't necessarily a negative thing to want to see peace amongst groups of people, and the church in particular, being in one accord and finding common ground and compromise. It's also seen, in the common book of prayer that they would produce. And some would even make the joke that according to an Anglican, you're doing worship correctly if everyone's unhappy, because nobody got completely what they wanted. So you have this compromise in place. The next item we have here is the other distinctive, is this idea of sacramental beauty. Anglicans are just oriented really towards the aesthetics of beauty. If you look at some of their churches, they're beautiful. If you look at some of their liturgy, it's just intricately crafted in a way that is beautiful. It really, the elements of it, tend to evoke wonder and mystery, both in the architect and in the liturgy, all of it. C.S. Lewis was an Anglican, and he indicated that Jesus is the myth that comes true. So there is this element of mystery. There's this element of beauty, and it's all falls into that area of sacramental beauty. Interestingly enough, Dan, you might find this interesting enough, is that the former president of the Vineyard Movement became an Anglican. Probably about, it looks like to me like about 8 years ago, maybe. He converted, and he is now Anglican and an Anglican bishop, I believe. Strange thing, I bought a book about his journey to Anglicanism. I haven't read it yet, but I do look forward to reading it. The next item on the Anglican Reformation distinctive is this idea of tolerance. They really were tired of the constant bloodletting and fighting that was going on amongst different areas, and so they really carved out a wide allowance for different views. Anglicans can be very judgment-free environments. They beyond the bare bones of baptisms. Anglicans were given great freedom in what they believed. The stool of faith requires 3 legs: scripture, tradition, and reason. And they just really were a tolerant group of people that allowed a lot. Number 5 is the church and state cooperation. Of course, Henry there on their picture. Anglican churches have often been just taken into and consumed into the state. The monarch in England is still the supreme governor and defender of the church. There's this very strong connection between church and state. There's an intricate hierarchy. Ministers, they perform not just their what we would think of clergy type duties, but there's actually stately duties that they're responsible for as well. And in many cases, even people's taxes still today go towards supporting the church. There's a very strong political involvement. And it's not necessarily just about being a good Christian. If there's this church-state cooperation, it's about making them and being a good citizen. The strong orientation to politics and how to change society. They've been historically very involved in different social movements. Okay, so the Radical Reformation, the first element of distinction here for the Radical Reformation would be the separation from the world. In the separation from the world, the key term there is separation. They wanted complete and total separation from the state was required, and they believed it was required in order for the church to be holy. They really believed that their moral purity required them to be separate from the world. Um, they were by and large pacifists because the Christians were not to be of this world. They were to be of another world. That means they weren't going to fight the battles of this world. They weren't going to swear oaths of allegiance to anyone in this world. They were going to let their yes be yes and their no be no. They were very separate. You see that today still in the Amish and some Mennonite communities. They maintain a very, very distinct, separate state, and that's part of their roots there as being part of the Radical Reformation, that separation that they would have. The next area of distinction for the Radical Reformation would be Biblicism. And this is the idea that the Bible is the only true authority. Its authority is not augmented by tradition. Tradition plays no part in giving us authority. The Bible's authority would negate anything from tradition. So it's really Bible and just Bible. The next distinction there is voluntaryism, and this is the idea that that you have to choose to be a member of the church. You don't just become a member of the church because you're born into a Christian family. Go to the baptisms. There's a believer's baptism, is what we're looking at, a credo, a creed baptism. And this is, the only authentic Christian is a person who makes an affirmation of Jesus Christ himself, subscribes to the creed, and so it's a voluntary process. They wanted none of this people being part of a culture or community that was Christian, so they were Christian too. They wanted everyone to know that it was you had to choose to be part of this yourself. The Amish today still do something interesting when their children get to be 18 years of age, I believe it is. They have to leave the Amish community and choose to come back again to be part of that community. There has to be a voluntary choice for them to rejoin the Amish community again on their own. Another element of distinction for the Radical Reformation would be this autonomy of governance, congregationalism. So in other words, that each congregation gets to rule itself. It has complete and total autonomy. You may have some loose bonds and fellowships and associations that occur between churches, but in the end, each church has its own distinct authority. And that's why Baptists have conventions. That they still today they don't want to be controlled by other some sort of overarching structure organization, because it really goes back to the voluntarism that they have to be able to make their own choices and distinctions. And some of the advantages of that, it can help in some ways, possibly. The cult of personality and doctrinal issues can really take over there when you have an individual who's in charge like that. Next item is liberty. And so the idea here is that there's a separation of church and state. Means that you can never have a church of the state. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. You don't have a central governmental church state. They wanted there to be a liberal society where they could have whatever church denomination that they wanted. The tolerance was really on the basis of this separation of church and state, and it would press for religious freedom. Hi, Dan. Well, that is it for my overview of the four different branches of the Protestant Reformation. And again, you have our little slide here of the tree of the Lutheran, the Radical, the Reformed, and the Anglican. Look forward to talking with you about these four branches. Bye.